Welcome to worshiptutorials.com. Today we have a special treat. I want to introduce you to a friend of mine who is going to be partnering with us a little bit on some projects here at Worship Tutorials. This is Chris Sligh.
Hello.
Chris is a worship leader currently based in
Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah. And Chris is a worship leader, songwriter, producer, recording artist. You may have heard some of Chris's songs either sung by Chris himself or by other people because he's written some songs that have been out there. And you also may know him from American Idol. What year were you on American Idol?
2007. Long time ago.
Top 10 finalist on American Idol. So Chris has actually partnered with my church to do some songwriting because we're releasing some original songs at my church. And so we brought him in, and yesterday we were over at Fuller's house. Fuller actually asked me to mention his name in the videos today.
He's a narcissist that
we
way.
did it. Fuller, you're in. And we were all over at Fuller's house, and we were just talking about worship leading, and Chris said something that kind of made my ears perk up. And if you read the title of this video, it might have made yours perk up too. He's like, we are not called to be worship leaders. And you were talking about worship leaders are not called to be worship leaders.
Yeah.
We're called to be something else. And I just thought, and we talked about this, and it was like, this was some really great wisdom and insight. And I thought it would be great to share it with you guys. So Chris, what do you mean we're not called to be worship leaders?
Well, thank you. It's nice to be thought of as having wisdom. That's always nice.
It was on display. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, I've been a worship leader now for, 22 years. And,
okay.
And I started in the early days of, I remember when, my church had never heard of Chris Tomlin,
Yeah.
And
there was a time before Chris
There was a time before Chris Tomlin. It was with the Paul Beloche and Britton Brown and Don Moen. And so I was the first contemporary worship leader of several churches in South Carolina. And as I look back on that time, I really felt like my calling was to be a worship leader. And so I really focused on the skill set of being on stage, leading people well, singing. And over the past probably 10 years, I began to come to this realization as I studied scripture and really dug into what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to be a disciple, and what it means to actually to be a servant. As a lot of us are paid or unpaid. We're working in churches, sometimes part-time. I worked part-time jobs in churches for years before American Idol. And so you work part-time, you might work full-time, whatever that is. I think sometimes we get so focused on my calling is to be a worship leader.
Right.
My calling is to be a worship leader. And I think that sometimes what I see comes out of that is a sort of entitlement. It's I'm a worship leader, so if I'm not leading worship, then I'm not advancing my calling.
I'm not doing what God has
called me to do. And I've seen young worship leaders that maybe aren't quite at the level at a church, at a mega church, and they really want to be on that stage, and it really is out of passion. I typically tend to try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't think it comes from a place of pride. I don't think it comes from a place of
Sure.
But I think it does come from a place of entitlement that is not I think entitlement can be a negative thing, but it can also be something that comes out of when we feel our calling, then we feel like we are entitled to do that thing because we are called to it by God. It's like this, and so we end up ultimately having a negative emotion that is based in what we feel like is true. And so as I begin to see this in, I was worship pastor and creative director at a couple of large churches in Texas and Chicago. And as I would work with young worship leaders, I began to see more and more this sort of entitlement that was coming out of it. And it was confusing to me because at the time I thought I was called to be a worship leader. And I thought about if I'm not on stage leading worship, would I be okay with it? And I slowly came to this realization as I studied. I think worship leading is a skill. Mm-hmm. I do not think it is a calling. And here's why, is because when we look at what we are actually called to, we are called to our spiritual gifts. And so those spiritual gifts, in Romans 12, that's going to be exhortation. It's going to be giving. It's going to be leadership. It's going to be mercy, prophecy, service, teaching. Mm-hmm. And obviously you want to have a well-rounded, I think we're called to those spiritual gifts, all of them, at some level. But we probably all of us have one that we are more called to. So for me, it's exhortation. Mm-hmm. I feel called to exhort. And the way that I make sense of it is that I feel called to disciple. Like my job as a worship leader is not to get up and sing well, though I think that's part contextually. I want to be as good as I can be because I feel like the best that I can give is excellence. So when I give my best, I hope that that's excellence.
Right.
But I don't think God is impressed by my excellence. Like, no matter how good I am, I'm never going to be as good as the heavens singing, in the firmaments.
There's always David Phelps singing "O Holy Night."
Yes.
Like, if you haven't seen that, go look it up on YouTube.
Absolutely.
It cannot be topped vocally.
It cannot be topped. Or, like, my buddy Phil Stacy was on my season of American Idol, one of the most gifted worship leaders I've ever seen. One of the greatest voices I've ever heard. Phil Stacy, like, he's one of those guys that whenever I was out at his church recently, and I got to lead worship next to him, and I just was like, why am I here? Like, like, he's unbelievable. But the thing is like, even Phil and I have these conversations, and we talk about, God isn't impressed by Phil's voice. God isn't impressed by my voice.
Yeah.
What I think he's, if he's impressed by anything,
I think God is maybe what pleases God.
Correct.
That's maybe a good word to use.
God is pleased when we step into our calling and we live that out.
Yeah.
And so for me, it is exhortation, discipleship. And so I look back on my life and I see I lived out that calling without realizing it for so long. Like, I always mentored younger guys and was discipling them and helping them become better. Now, granted, I thought I was helping them step into their calling as a worship leader. But ultimately, what I realized is that I was stepping into my calling as a discipler, as an exhorter. And it even carries over into how I my congregation. Yeah. When I'm speaking to my congregation, we're going to do a video about this a little bit later. But like, when I'm talking to my congregation, I'm calling them to something. I'm exhorting them. I'm calling them to something greater. Because Elias Doomer, who's a lead singer of City Harmonic, he and I have gotten to be friends. Yeah. And one of the things that he said that just blew my mind, and I just quote it as often as possible now, is he said, worship disciples and disciples worship. And I went, yes, that is what I've been trying to say for years and years.
So
and
say
years.
that again. Worship disciples. So
worship disciples.
When we worship, we are being discipled.
Correct.
Right.
Like, if we see it as just singing, if our congregation, because I think most of us worship leaders don't see it as singing songs.
For those of us who may feel like that's what leading worship is, there's so much more to it.
There is, yeah.
And that's why we exist here at Worship Tutorials.
Yes.
To help you. But yeah, there's so much more to leading worship than just singing.
But if our congregation sees it as just singing songs, or they see it as a concert, or they see it as like, we have the music to set up the message, like that kind of mentality, then we are failing to disciple our congregation through worship. And I think that's part of our job. So worship disciples and disciples worship. So if we are making disciples, if we are exhorting and discipling our congregation through our worship, then what we're going to see is that we are going to see like massive uptick in how people are engaging in worship. Yes. And this is not something that I'm just speaking as like an ideal. Like, this is something that I've literally lived out and seen happen through the power of God, where we took the time to exhort and disciple our congregation, and we saw massive uptick in these people. We see all these articles about like, why are your people not singing? And it's because the range is too high,
or the lights are too low.
Lights are too low, or this kind of stuff. And I mean, maybe in different cultures and different churches, maybe that's the reason. If you change, anytime you change culture too fast, it inhibits your ability to disciple, because change management is so important. Right?
Yes, it jars people, right?
But the reason why your people are not singing, I guarantee you, has nothing to do with those things. Yes. The reason why your people are not singing is because you have not done a good job of discipling them.
That's a hard truth, but it is, I wholeheartedly
It's a hard
believe
truth that I had to believe about myself. I had to come to this like belief. My people are not singing. Like, there's a famous Craig Rochelle quote where he talks about at Life Church. They are never allowed to say, our people don't do something. They are only allowed to say, our people have not yet been taught to do something. That's
powerful.
And when I bought into that idea and I realized, man, the way Craig Rochelle puts it is that every problem in church is a leadership problem. And so if we have the humility...
Every problem is a leadership problem.
If we have the humility as leaders to go, you know what?
That does take a great deal of humility.
Oh, man. That is what I want to live. And I think in order to be a true discipler, an exhorter, whatever that is. You have to live in these other spiritual gifts like service and giving. And you live in these other, you have to understand that we as worship leaders, it is not about us.
Yeah.
That ultimately we are disciples who are in turn discipling.
Yes.
And we happen to use worship to do that.
Yeah.
And so if your gift is leadership, if your gift is prophecy, if your gift is service, then live out that spiritual gift and how you lead your people in worship. Mine happens to be discipleship, exhortation.
Yeah.
Mine happens to be that.
Right.
So I live that out in how I lead people in worship.
Yeah, and we're going to make another video, at least one more video today. And so check that out, but Chris is going to talk about like how to build moments into your worship service where you as a worship leader or somebody in leadership, it could, you could build this moment and have a pastor whose gift is exhortation, discipleship, come onto the stage. It doesn't have to be you, but you can lead this.
Yes.
Come onto the stage and exhort encourage the congregation, teach them in a way that just flows and feels natural. So that video will also be available. We'll link to it below. You said something earlier about like, I'm called to be a worship leader. So I can't, like, if I take a job in, retail or if I follow a different career path. Like I worked in a lab for years after I graduated from college because I'm a science guy. And it was like, a lot of people I think might feel like that young in college, whatever, I'm called to be a worship leader. So if I take a different career path, then
I'm actually kind of spitting in the face of my calling.
But that's not true. No. It's not true at all.
The truth that I have found is that, so for instance, at my church in Nashville, we live in Nashville, and Cross Point, the church that I attend, is one of the most talent-filled churches in America. Like, it's unbelievable the amount of talent. Yeah. I mean, like, when I play, down through the years as I've played, I'm playing with Keith Urban's guitar player and, and this guy, this famous country artist, keyboard player, and this famous Christian artist drummer. And, I mean, it's unbelievable, talent.
Yeah.
And so we have 6 campuses. And so this is something that I've had to live out in my own life as far as like coming to this place of going like my calling is not to be a worship leader because my family attends the Nashville campus. They were asking me to serve about a campus that's about 45 minutes. It was about an hour and a half away from my home. And it got to the place where the weekends that I was not on the road, which I'm on the road about 35 to 40 weekends a year, the weekends that I was not on the road, I was spending all day Sunday away from my family. Just didn't feel like that was
a familiar
that was not my calling. My first calling is to my family, obviously. And so I just went in and I said, hey guys, I know this may and I'm totally okay. I'm not putting an ultimatum, but if I'm going to lead, can I lead at my campus, please? And I don't have to lead. I can just play guitar. I can do whatever. And they came back and they were like, hey man, we're pretty filled up with the Nashville. And so what I did is I just went, hey, whenever you have a spot, I'll play. I don't have to lead. I'll just play guitar. And so what I did is the weeks that I'm home that I am not on stage, which is, now it's probably 3 or 4 times a year that I'm on stage, I actually serve on the parking team. And I go in and I drive. We have this massive, it's in downtown Nashville, our main campus, and the parking is all over the place. And so literally we have golf carts, where we go around and we pick people up and take them back, especially when it's cold or rainy. Yeah. And so when I'm home, I actually get on my golf cart, for 2 services, and I drive around and pick people up and take them back. This one Sunday, I had already been asked to serve on the parking team, and the Nashville campus came to me and said, hey, could you do a special? We do featured songs from time to time, and I was like, sure, but when is it in the service? And so they actually had to put in like a buffer after I did the special so that I could get back out to my golf cart in order to get people out. And it was like this really cool moment because like people are like, weren't you just singing the song? And I literally had like 10 conversations with like my calling is to serve. I just thought it was super cool that I got to serve, and then I got to serve. And I think that as worship leaders, sometimes we're so scared that if we're not on stage, that our service is not going to be seen, and that our calling is not going to be seen.
And that's an ego.
And I don't think it's true.
Right. And even if your service is not seen, it doesn't matter.
Yep.
We don't do it. Jesus taught about that a lot. the most famous teaching would be of the Pharisees who prayed out loud. Or at least that's the one that I think of.
Yes.
He's like, look at these guys, they've received their reward. You know? Or the one, as they give, they throw all their money in so that everyone hears it. And he's like, they've received their reward. Yeah. But the woman who gave in secret and gave just a small amount, but it was all she had.
Absolutely.
You know, she was the one who received the reward from God, the Father in heaven. So I was a youth pastor for a while. Yep. And I had lots of conversations with junior high and senior high students who were genuine, like very genuine in their desire, and asked me, like, how do I know what God is calling me to? And it was almost always from a perspective, and I think this is because of where we live, like in America, Western, you know, I think it was almost always framed in, what is God calling me to do as a vocation? Yeah. Like, what should I major in college?
Here's a strange thing about America. In Europe, I think it's like 20% of people tie what they do with who they are. In America, it's 80%.
It's way higher, yeah.
We believe, incorrectly by the way, we believe that we are what we do. Yeah. And I believed that I was what I did. Yeah. But here's what I think I would tell people is, like, what you're called to as a human being who happens to be a believer is you are called to the fruit of the Spirit. Yes. You're called to live out the Beatitudes. The end. That's it. Yeah. The end. Like, that's it. That's what you're called to. And then you have a spiritual calling on your life. Yeah. That might call you to ministry to live out that spiritual calling, that spiritual gift. Yeah. And it might not. Yeah. And I think that sometimes we have this idea that ministry is this higher calling. And now, granted, I've been lucky enough that I've literally lived in ministry for most of my adult life. Yeah. And there are times where I confuse that, where I feel like I'm called, but I wasn't living out the fruit of the Spirit. Yeah. I wasn't living out the Beatitudes. And here I am in ministry, and, like, what am I doing? Like,
you feel pretty like a shell if you're not.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're the sarcophagus that is really good looking on the outside, but it's just.
What did Jesus call it? The whitewashed tombs again to the Pharisees.
I was a Pharisee. Yeah. You know, and I think that that's the thing is when we realize how to live out the fruit of the Spirit, when we focus on that, live out the fruit of the Spirit, live out the Beatitudes, and then we step into our spiritual calling. Yeah. Honestly, I don't know that what you do for a job is all that important.
And you know what I would tell those students? I would always share with them my story. Because I have an interesting, I have a weird background. Yeah. Like, I grew up in a very, Christ-centered home, and I'm very grateful for that. I went to a Christian university. I thought I was going to go into ministry, but I ended up doing science because, I enjoyed it. And, I have business education background, I have science education, and I don't do any of that stuff. But I always tell people, like, looking back on my life, I found that if you are attentive to the leading of the Holy Spirit, you will begin to see how God leads you into things. And it's weird. You look back on it and, like, I would have never predicted the moves that were made, that I was able to make. Yeah. From a vocational standpoint, like worship tutorials, for example, is my full-time job. Like, as far as, like, what pays the bills and what I do every day. I would have never assumed that would happen. Yeah, yeah. I always would tell students, like, stop worrying about what you're gonna do. Yeah. Worry more about how you feel the Holy Spirit leading you. Because you will begin to see doors open and doors close and opportunities present themselves. And you will know, like, God is leading me into this opportunity. And it's probably not going to be anything you expect. Because I do believe that God desires for us to, like, what God wants for us is so much bigger. Yeah. And so much greater than what we could ever imagine for ourselves.
I think it's more important that not what we do, but how we do it. Mm-hmm. When we lead with the fruit of the Spirit, I just keep going. I lead with this because this has literally been my heart's cry for the last 3 years. I had an executive pastor who was a mentor of mine, and one day he called me into his office and he's like, "Chris, you're the most talented person I've ever met, but you are a jerk." And so I had to take this really deep inward look, and for him it was just like, man, I want you to memorize the fruit of the Spirit, and I just want you every day to ask, are you living this out? Yeah. Look at the Beatitudes. Every day, are you a peacemaker? Every day, are you poor in spirit? Every day? And I just go through, And so this is my heart's cry because it has revolutionized my life. It has just changed everything about what I do and how I do it. And I've seen such an incredible work of God in my life that I want to challenge other people that what you do is not all that important. Yeah. Honestly, if I have to go get a job at Costco next week, I hope I can live with the same grace and the same fruit that I live with as someone who travels around and goes to churches and helps them take next steps with their church worship teams. And when I challenge and lead worship at all these churches that I get to go to, if I can't live with the same fruit at Costco, then I am doing it wrong.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
The end. Yeah. My calling is not to be a worship leader. My calling is to live out who God has called me to be.
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much for sharing.
Yes.
Check out that link in the video below. I'm gonna ask Chris to talk about too how to build those moments into your service and encourage, exhort your congregation to worship. See you next time.